All right, here's a big question. Are we in a wage price spiral, which is going to make inflation overall worse? Well, United Airlines says, yeah, we are. Here to talk about it is the great Kevin Hassett, former chair of the Council of Economic Advisors and author of the most important book of the century called Adrift, Stopping America's Slide to Socialism. Boy, you got a tougher and tougher job there, my friend. All right, let's talk about United.
It's true.
14.5% increase for their pilots over the next 18 months. Seems like a big number, Kevin, and seems like an indicator that we are in a wage price spiral. What's your take?
Right. Well, that's exactly how it happens, is that prices go up, and then people who work for the company that see the price inflation say, hey, wait a minute, you know, my salary hasn't gone up. And you should do that with Fox, by the way, Larry. And then they adjust your salary for inflation, and then they have to charge higher prices, and then it just keeps going and going. And, you know, one metric, Larry, of how out of whack things are is that, and it shows that people don't understand the world we're in yet, that durable goods actually kind of surprised on the upside, right? They were up 0.7. But according to the Fed, durable goods production was down 0.2 in the same months. And that's because output, you know, sales didn't keep up with price inflation. And so inflation is out of control, and wages are trying to catch up. And as they do, they're going to push inflation even higher. So I think the odds of the Fed making progress on inflation this year are starting to look pretty small.
Well, here's it. Let's bring in the Bank for International Settlements. Not everybody in the world knows what that is, but it's a very important institution. It's the central bank clearinghouse for other central banks. It has a very good research department. There's no politics involved in this thing. Sure. And they just basically whacked the big industrial countries for keeping real interest rates, you know, nominal rates adjusted for inflation, way, way, way too low. And by the way, they said as long as that persists, an inflation spiral, but a wage price spiral, and a 1970s type story. So I went back and looked, Kevin. You know, no matter what measure you use, you could use 8.5%, 8.6% CPI. You could use core PCE deflator. That's about 6%. You could use the 2-year CPI break-evens. That's about 4%. But 1.75% isn't even remotely close to any of these metrics. Now, is the BIS right? Is this something that the Fed should really be looking to?
Yeah, absolutely. And you know that there's an inside baseball kind of thing, but I know you and your viewers love inside baseball about the BIS, which is that the central banks around the world send their very, very best researchers there as kind of like, you know, a reward for great work. You get to spend a year in Basel. It's really, really sweet. And so what happens is the very, very best researchers at the central banks hang out together for a year, and then they go back and they bring what they learned that year back to the central bank. And so what's going on is the BIS is basically creating a little impulse that's going to affect monetary policy all around the world. And it's very, very easy to summarize what this message from the BIS is. And that is, you know, basically you got to keep raising interest rates until you see inflation going down. So we don't care if you have a recession. We don't care if the economic data show weakness. You got to keep hiking until inflation goes down, or we're going to enter a strange new world. It's a very, very chilling report by the BIS, actually.
Well, okay, so it's a good report. It's a tough report. Question, Kevin Hassett, is do you think Jay Powell is reading that report, and is this having an impact on him?
I got to say his language has been, you know, sort of as hawkish as you and I were a few months ago, right? But it's been extremely hawkish. He's basically said that he's not very confident that they're going to be able to engineer a soft landing, and that they're going to persevere to get inflation back down. So I think, yes, the Fed is absolutely going to keep the pedal to the metal until the economy slows down enough. But the problem is that that's a good long ways off, because wages right now are just catching up with prices. And as we saw with the United data, you know, that there's going to be a heck of a lot of stories like that where people are seeing 10, 12, 14% salary increases, which sounds great, but it's just keeping up with inflation if you look at some of the top-line numbers.
Now, Kevin, I was reading your articles in National Review, and lo and behold, I got so excited about this. I read them last night or something. Anyway, you're saying, you know, we should have supply-side policies to produce more goods. That's one way of getting at the inflation. And then you have in this, most important supply-side part of the Trump tax cuts, namely the expensing of capital equipment. I just died. I was so happy to see that. You cannot believe how happy I was to see that. I've been saying that sort of thing for years and years and years and years. And the expensing of capital equipment, which is depreciation, machinery, equipment, all that stuff that would boost productivity and so forth, that stuff expires, what is it, next year does it expire? I mean, we better start thinking about it.
It starts expiring next year, that's right.
Right. So, I don't know, Biden and them want to raise... we got to get on this. That's my only point. We've got to get on this.
Right. They need to legislate it this year or it's going to start expiring. And this, by the way, as you know, Larry, is just simple economics. It's not a partisan view. In fact, the very, very first policy discussion, being a person who likes to study economic policy history about this was between Richard Musgrave, a Harvard professor, and JFK. So Richard Musgrave and JFK talked about the wonders of expensing. And then JFK said, absolutely, let's do expensing, but it's too complicated to call it expensing. The voters won't understand, so let's have an investment tax credit that does the same thing. But JFK actually 100% understood about expensing and was convinced about it. Musgrave told me the story once. And so it's not a partisan issue. In fact, you could call expensing a Democratic idea to begin with. And so Joe Biden needs to get behind it, because if he doesn't, then there's going to be no supply impulse, and inflation is going to have to be fought by the Fed all by itself, and that means deep recession.
I have heard, I actually have heard, and I ran a panel a couple of years ago, before we had the Trump administration, in Connecticut. It was Stevie Cohen's place. Glenn Hubbard was debating Larry Summers, and I was the moderator, all right? Glenn Hubbard, Larry Summers. And they both agreed on one thing: expensing machinery and equipment to produce more productivity and more growth on the supply. They didn't agree on the tax rate, the corporate tax rate, and then the impact of it on revenues and all that stuff. But they agreed. So there's a bipartisan thing. And I just can't underscore how important this expensing provision would be. That's why I was so thrilled when I read that, you went after it. And then one last one you had that I think deserves a shout out here. Small business tax rate. We never really, we gave them a big credit because of Senator Ron Johnson, if you recall. But we never actually cut the rate. And what rate does this, they pay the personal tax rate. Which is, of course, always under threat. So you're promoting two really important things here, buddy.
Well, thanks. And small businesses absolutely need a break. But to go back to inflation and the expensing, one of the things I'm noticing is that a paper I co-authored with Glenn Hubbard, who was at that debate, was like the last paper written on inflation and the cost of capital, inflation and firm investment, because inflation has been so stable, people stopped studying it. But if you go back 20 years to when Glenn and I wrote the paper, you can see that when inflation picks up, then the difference between, depreciation and expensing becomes enormous. And the cost of capital goes up enormously. This was Marty Feldstein, bless his souls, one of his number one issues was inflation and the cost of capital. And if we don't extend expensing, then the high inflation means that when you deduct the cost of buying your machine 2 or 3 years from now, then the value of that depreciation allowance is going to be way, way lower. And so the cost of capital goes way up and supply contracts. And so there's going to be a big supply contraction because of the cost capital effect of Biden's inflation. And the only way to offset it is to have expensing.
Yeah, well, as I said, Hubbard and Summers agree. This was investor Steve Cohen's house. It was a while back, 5, 6 years ago. I don't know, but they also agreed. Now, my last question is, Kevin, will you pray on the 50-yard line? It's legal now.
Yeah, I've said a lot of prayers during sporting events, but I don't think any of them have ever been answered. So.
I know. Yeah, we'd both pray in the end zone. Let's hope we get there anyway.
Especially on the putting green, right?
I pray every time I hit a backhand. Anyway, Kevin Hassett, terrific stuff. I appreciate it.